not often that you have a chance to study and live history at the same time. And as a student at Kent State, I did that. I'd grown up in Kent. My dad, we moved there when I was in 7th grade. My dad had been hired to be the head football coach there. And so I went to the local schools, knew people that owned the banks and the hardware store. The university was about the same size, if not larger, than the population of the town, which was also made for a little bit of a town-gown split. The biggest employer in Portage County. But going to Kent State for me was automatic because if your parents worked for the university, it was free. So we can do free, and I did. So I ended up going to Kent, graduating in '69 from Kent Roosevelt High School, and started at Kent State. That fall was a social studies major, but my focus was history. So I can recall being in a history lecture, looking out the window, and watching an anti-war protest go by the window. And it was like we were living history. This was a very, very interesting time in American history. We were a different generation than our parents. The World War II generation, now we had the baby boomers. And you had there's a lot of talk now about whether we are more fractionalized than we've ever been, more divided than we've ever been since the Civil War. We can debate it, but having lived through, not the Civil War, but certainly the Vietnam era, I think today does not compare to how split we were then. Because it wasn't just a war of words back then. It was an actual war. I mean, people were killed. They were killed at Kent State. There were bombings by the Weather Underground of artworks. Look at the Thinker in front of the Cleveland Art Museum. It was blown up by the Weather Underground. Did the same thing in Chicago. You had a bomb-making factory that the Weather Underground had in New York City that inadvertently went off. They were going to plant that bomb at a camp in New Jersey, a military base in New Jersey. So I think people that weren't alive back then have a hard time comparing the two eras. The question on campus wasn't so much whether there was going to be a revolution, but when. I mean, that's how divided we were. I don't think we're quite there yet, but nevertheless, it certainly was a time when, if you were a student on campus, especially at Kent, it really did make you think about everything you'd been taught growing up. What is patriotism? What is proper dissent and peaceable dissent? And we had things we had been told growing up, many of us, we were still getting the World War II generation's version of history as students, and finding out later that some of the things we'd been taught weren't necessarily 100% true. And so we got to college, and you kind of got a different version of history from your professors than you got in high school. So a very interesting time, but I say to be witnessing history while you're studying it was certainly incredible, a very interesting experience. And now to look back at it and see all the different views of what happened at Kent, and pretty much most of it in front of my eyes, is also interesting. You have different people that say, this is what started the shooting, no, that's what started the shooting, and these, so it's often like the people that view an accident and you interview them later and you get 5 different versions. We're still talking about why they fired, and that's still not
discerned.
It isn't. There's no universal agreement even now about what exactly happened. So as I say, I grew up in Kent, went to Kent State, and I was opposed to the war, but I would call myself then a liberal, not a radical. Not tear the system down, but through elections we could change the system. Problem was we couldn't vote at that time because you had to be 21, and we weren't 21. But nevertheless, had supported verbally at least Humphrey, and that's kind of where I was. and when it was opposed to Nixon, was opposed to the Vietnam War, but not, again, a radical. And there were radicals on campus at Kent and other places. So on April 30th, Richard Nixon goes on national TV to announce that he's going to send troops into Cambodia to try to hasten the end of the Vietnam War, which he had promised to end when he got elected in '68. And the next day on campus, on May 1st, there was a protest on the Commons, which is kind of the center of the campus, and it was by a group of graduate history students who came up with an acronym of WHORE. World Historians, can't remember the rest of it, but it was a very quiet event. They said, well, Nixon's buried the Constitution, so let's bury it. And so they ripped a copy of the Constitution out of a history book, dug a hole, and buried it. And I thought, that's going to be it. That was the end of it. I even have the flyer from World Historians Opposed to Racism and Exploitation, which is just a group they made up. But I thought that was it. I thought that, okay, that Kent State's had their protest. That Friday night, so May 1st was a Friday, I went downtown. Ken had a very active bar scene and music scene. And Friday night, I never missed it. Went downtown, walked down Water Street, which is where most of the bars were. It's where the James Gang played, the Raspberries, and others. And saw that a group had taken over the middle of the street, bonfire and everything. And went up to them, what the hell is this all about? Oh, we're going to end the war. And it's like, are you nuts? That's not going to end the war. If it's going to do anything, it's going to piss the people off that we're trying to win over to our side. This is, you know, Middle America, we don't want them to support this war, but if you start to act like Nixon says, you're giving Nixon ammunition, because he's saying bad things about us, and this is just going to feed that. So breaking the windows at the auto parts store across the street isn't going to make that guy sympathetic to what we're trying to do and end this war. But they weren't going to listen. I grabbed a pitcher out of a bar, filled it with water, and I went out to put the fire out to stop bringing
Wow.
into it.
Wow.
Stupid. Fortunately, the bouncer grabbed the pitcher before I could get out of the bar, poured the water out. So I didn't actually try to do that and get killed by the mob. They marched downtown, breaking windows, destroying, causing damage to the banks and the other small businesses along the way. Police were called. That was kind of the beginning of it. And that was Friday night. And then the mayor was concerned that there was going to be a repeat of that Saturday night. There were local merchants were threatened that if they didn't put anti-war posters in their windows, they would be targeted. So the mayor is hearing all kinds of rumors. He's hearing rumors that revolutionaries are come to start the revolution at Kent. So he calls the Ohio National Guard and sets a curfew for Saturday night, calls the Ohio National Guard and asks for them to come and help because the Kent Police and the Sheriff's Department aren't sufficient in Portage County. And they finally agreed. It was very late before they did agree because the closest contingent of Guard were already deployed at a trucker strike in Akron. But that strike had ended, so they were able to redeploy them in Kent. And the Guard came to Kent then that evening just to set up in Kent, to enforce a curfew in Kent. They were not going to the campus. But on the way there, they found out that the group had gathered on campus, marched around, it got to be about 2,000 strong, and they attacked one of the ROTC buildings on campus and burned it to the ground. The firemen from Kent that went to put it out from the city of Kent were attacked. Their hoses were chopped into pieces. They were physically attacked. The building burnt down. Now the Guard comes onto campus to protect state property because it could happen again. There were two other ROTC buildings that hadn't been touched. The fear was they would be next.
Now, were OTC buildings like dorms where the ROTs?
At Kent, they were pretty decrepit. They were two leftover buildings from World War II that had housed, that provided temporary housing during World War II. So they were in terrible shape, but nevertheless, they were being used by the ROTC programs. So they were there. So the guard came onto campus, surrounded the building while it was on fire, pushed the crowd away. So now you have the guard not only in Kent, but now on at Kent State, and that's how they ended up being there. Then Sunday there was a protest that the guard broke up. A few people were bayoneted, although as interesting as it sounds, no one required serious medical attention. But tensions are getting heightened. The guard is being attacked physically. There are interviews that are now posted on the Kent State May 4th site of guardsmen at Kent during this period. In statements they make, you can see things are getting ratcheted up. Two guardmen can be heard talking on a Sunday night interview saying that the protesters had marched toward President White's house. They wanted to speak to him, they said, but the guard had surrounded the house and fired tear gas to keep them away. These two guardsmen were interviewed and said, yeah, we were told that when we shot the tear gas and ordered them to disperse, if they didn't, we were free to shoot. So now you have that being discussed. And I should mention a really important thing that happened Sunday in the afternoon was the governor of Ohio came to visit the campus. It was James Rhodes, and he was in a very heated election for U.S. Senate in the Republican primary. He had been term limited, couldn't run again as governor.
I see.
And so he was running on a law and order ticket, and he was running against Taft, and they had just had a debate the night before, and he came onto campus. Governor Rhodes did and gave a very inflammatory speech comparing those that had participated in Friday night and Saturday night's destruction as worse than brown shirts, the revolutionaries, the night riders, the worst kind of people in America, and we're going to put an end to it. We're not going to let this campus be closed. The county prosecutor had wanted to close the campus because of what had happened. He said, I'm not going to let that happen. You know, I'm in charge, we're in charge, and school's going to continue to be held. And there was some talk of shooting at that press conference. I think it was the fire chief or someone, maybe it was the State Highway Patrol leader, had said, you know, in the past we've come under sniping at this point, and I want you to know we're prepared to deal with this. So, Monday, class is held, it's midterm week, and you see military half-tracks all over the place, guardsmen in every building, and all protests have been banned, but one had been called for noon on Monday. And as I walked out of my psychology midterm, a friend of mine from high school, who was a Kent State student, passed me a leaflet announcing the rally. And so I did not have class at that point, so I went and watched. And the vast majority of the people in the Commons were like me, just watching. So at one end of the Commons, it would be the west end of the Commons, kind of an oval-shaped center, grassy area. At the west end, where the RTC building was, that's where the guard was lined up. Opposite them, about a football field and a half away on the east side, at the base of at the base of a hill by Taylor Hall, was a group probably about 250, 300 active protesters. And when noon came, a jeep went out from the guard lines, and it was General Canterbury that ordered the jeep to go out, telling them it was an illegal rally, they had to disperse. That caused the crowd to react and shout back things, obscenities, throw things at the jeep. And so finally the jeep came back, and they loaded their guns, and they had tear gas canisters that they had a special type of launcher to use. So they loaded up and they marched across the campus toward the protesters, shooting the tear gas as they went. And I'm watching this whole thing, and it's farcical, because the soldiers are dressed as though they are heading into battle in Vietnam. I mean, tear gas masks, helmets, M1 rifles that can be deadly at 2 miles,
Jeez.
Bayonets, of course the tear gas. A few had shotguns, a few had pistols. And across them are a group of kids in tie-dye t-shirts and blue jeans, right? And so it seemed farcical, and as they shot the tear gas the canisters would go up in the air, come down, hit the ground. The students were picking them up and throwing them back. So the tear gas was not being effective at breaking up the crowd. So the guard, as they got close to the crowd, to the crowd of anti-war protesters, the protesters started to move away. And what they did was they went backward. There was, at the very top of the hill behind them was Taylor Hall, an architecture building. At the top of this hill, it's called Blanket Hill. They walked back up to get away from the guard, and the guard, 2 units of the guard chased them up over that hill. Down the other side of the hill to where there was a practice football field. The guard went to the practice football field, which was probably a big mistake. First of all, when they got to the top of that hill, they should have just stopped and turned around and come back because they'd achieved their objective of breaking up the rally. But now they've intermixed the protesters with all the kids that were just onlookers, and they can't tell who's who. Now they're on the practice football field, and on 2.5 sides of the practice football field, there's a large fence. And protesters and onlookers are all on the other sides of them, and they're kind of boxed in. And you can see them conferring. At one point, a group of them gets down on one knee and threatens to shoot a small group that was throwing rocks at them in the Prentice Hall parking lot at the bottom of the east side of Blanket Hill. They don't shoot, and instead they get back up and start to march back in the direction they'd come. Well, those that were throwing things at them, seeing that the guard threatened to shoot but didn't, thought they'd given up, they're not going to shoot, or they don't have anything in those guns. A lot of the people thought the guns were empty. They couldn't believe that guardsmen would come with guns that were loaded. So the guard stood up and marched back up that hill, going back to the very tip of it by Taylor Hall. And as they're going up the hill, they're looking back over their shoulder. The group that was closest to Taylor Hall and closest to the protesters was Troop G. That group, 25, 35 or so men, when they got close to the top of the hill, that group turned in unison, 130 degrees, and faced back down toward the hill and began firing. That was the first group to fire. Other guardsmen were still walking in the opposite direction down toward in a westerly direction toward the Commons, and you can see in the pictures that they're totally startled. They have no idea what's going on. They don't know why these people are shooting. And even Canterbury, who's in that group, you can see he's shocked. He's turned around and you can just see he's startled. He doesn't know what's going on. And the shooting goes on for 13 seconds. 13 were either killed or injured. You had 4 killed, you had 9 injured. The closest person injured was 60 feet away, so there wasn't anybody real close. The 4 fatalities were all over 200 feet away. Of those shot, only 2 were shot in the front. All the rest were shot in the side or the back. And there is a video that was taken of the shooting. It's not very clear. It's very grainy. It was taken from a considerable distance by a student in a dormitory. And you can see, as the guard moves up the hill, you can see students walking in their direction. You can see a puff of smoke as the guns begin to fire, and then you can see the students just absolutely bat out of hell, running the other direction to get out of fire. But that shooting continued. If the guard, as they later claimed, felt their lives were in danger and they were being rushed and that their weapons might be taken away, the moment they started to fire, that danger was gone. They didn't have to continue to fire for 13 seconds, which kind of leads me to believe, it was that there was a lot of anger and passion there. We're going to get them.
Yeah.
I've had enough of this crap.
Yeah.
I'm also suspicious of the fact that it took place at the top of the hill, which is, from a military point of view, that's the high ground, right?
Yeah.
Not at the bottom.
King of the hill.
And why would a small group turn and fire? Now, the others did turn and fire too when they saw that small group firing, but most of them fired into the air. If everybody up there, all the guardsmen up there had fired, there were about 100 of them, you would have had many more fatalities if they had fired at students. I did not see the shooting. When the guard chased the students up over the hill, I remained back on the commons. And I only saw the guard come back down the hill.
You heard it though?
I didn't even hear it.
Oh.
And I'm still trying to recollect and figure out why I didn't hear it. And I think what I did was when I saw the guard chase the students over the hill, I went to the student center, which was a short distance away, and then came back to that position, because it was about a 20-minute period from the time the guard first marched out toward the students to the time of the shooting. And I think for 10 minutes or so, including the time of the shooting, I had left the area, and then when I came back is when I saw the guardsmen coming back down the hill. And then students streaming over and joining us onlookers and saying what had happened. And most of the onlookers couldn't believe it, but then did believe it, because well, two of the people that came to tell me had blood all over them because they'd been giving first aid to students. And of course later we heard more about it. But there was almost an even bigger massacre, if you will, because now you had 2,000 people who were enraged. You had 200 to 300 that were active anti-war protesters, but now you had 2,000 to 3,000 people having heard what had happened, can't believe what had happened, and are pissed and angry. Right. And there are many in that group who said, we're going to go get them. We don't care what they do to us. Go ahead, you can kill us. And they wanted to rush the guard that were only about 20 feet away.
What stopped them?
Well, the guard, there were faculty marshals trying to intercede here, including the professor I'd had in psychology that day for that final, or midterm. They walked over to the guard and said, look, you've done enough damage here today, why don't you at least leave those students alone, they're not harming anybody. And the guard commander said, you're going to have to get them out of here. You have 5 minutes to do it, or we're coming to get them. We're coming after them. So there was going to be a major event. And who knows what would have happened, because the guard was outnumbered, but none of the students had guns or weapons. Well, so what happened is the faculty marshals came over to try to calm the students down, to get them to not do something stupid like attack the guard. And what the psychology professor, being a psychologist, said, look, why don't you all sit down? And when he got everybody to sit down, that really helped. And then Professor Frank, who was a geology professor, he said, look, these people are going to come and kill you. They are summertime soldiers. They don't know what they're doing. They're poorly trained. They're going to come and kill you. We've already had enough death on this campus. For God's sake, if you never listen to anybody in your life, listen to me. We've got to leave. You've got to leave. And then you could hear a chant of the students, leave, leave, and they left. The university was closed. We had to finish school by mail back then.
How long was
And it set off the largest student strike in American history. Something like several hundred colleges around the United States were closed for the rest of the semester as a result of that.
The shots that were fired reverberated in reaction to the direction opposite of what the people trying to control things did. And when you go to the national level of the kids and then take it international with, Neil Young did within 4 days.
So it was international news. It was the first time students had been killed in an anti-war protest on a campus in American history. It wasn't the first time students had been killed on a campus by police or guards, but it was the first time that had been an anti-war. There had been civil rights. I think it was Orangeburg. It happened a few years before that. A historically black college in South Carolina. But that was the civil rights protest. So it shocked America. Interestingly, the polling showed the vast majority of Americans condemned the students.
Correct.
And didn't sympathize with the students. So that's what I experienced. And then years later, with my teaching degree, when I was teaching at Shaker, I want to make history come alive. It should. It shouldn't be boring. And so I had a 2-day lesson that I put together on the Kent State shooting that had slides, and I went through each thing in a chronology. And then there was an audio tape that we had all been provided in our yearbook that year of interviews, on-the-spot radio broadcasts, and of what had happened day by day.
Wow.
from WKSU reporters.
Wow. Who made that KSU itself?
Most of it's from WKSU reporters who were there tape recording, walking around, and so you can hear the governor's speech when he came and was angry and pounding the table, and we're going to put an end to this. You can hear the Jeep go out and tell the students they have to disperse. You can hear the students yelling back. So all of this I put in a slideshow and had the audio sync to the specific slide. And then there's a tape recording of the shooting too. I didn't have the video at that time of the shooting. I just had a tape recording of the sound of the shooting. And then of the kids afterward yelling and screaming for an ambulance and all of that. So it was a 2-day thing in history and government that I used it. And I still have students today that's the one thing they remember. Oh, Mr. Strang, the Kent State shooting.
You know, and that is, I think you jarred some neurons in my head, because that sounded familiar, and that would be neat to be able to, if you've ever made a film version of it. You know.
Well, what I did, so I left teaching, went to law school at night, had to give up coaching to do that, but became a lawyer, and so kind of put the Kent State slideshow away, and was asked. A group of lawyers called the Manos Inn of Court. They were doing a whole series on great trials in Cleveland, and one of the greatest trials, and great in terms of size, substance, importance, were the civil cases and criminal cases surrounding the Kent State shooting. Those were all tried in Cleveland. 8 guardsmen were indicted, and there was a trial. And then there was the civil case when the students that were injured and killed, their parents, sued the guardsmen. Those were it. The civil trial was one of the largest of all time at that time. So, knowing of my Kent State connection, they asked me if I would speak, and I went back to get my slides to do my slideshow, and I found they didn't exist. They deteriorated completely.
No. Oh boy!
Which turned out to be a blessing, because I found that I could do a PowerPoint off the internet that was 10 times better, and so I started from scratch, found a much larger selection of pictures. Was able to dub in the same audio that I had before, and found the video, and was able to dub that into the slides. And so it's a better program now, and I've used that, and I've now spoken, I think 7 or 8 times in the last year and a half. I did a presentation at the Music Box Supper Club.
Okay.
We had a huge crowd, and I kind of gear it depending whether it's a lawyer or non-lawyer crowd. I just gave it at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law last October. And I've reached out to several high schools to go in and do that. So I can adjust it by how much time, and then whether it's a law audience or not, how much time I spend on the cases. So it had a significant connection to the Cleveland area because of the trials.
Your perspective is far more diverse than most people's is on this topic.
And the Shaker Heights High School connection, I just want to mention one thing about that, and that is, when I did those lessons, of course, the Kent State saga hadn't ended, because you still had those criminal and civil cases, and the 1 year the civil case was still going on, and so the kids were reading about it and now knowing about what had happened. And then there was a big issue about moving the gym where the practice football field was located at Kent State, where the guard went and momentarily got on one knee. There was a gym at the end of that football field that the university deemed as inadequate, and they wanted to put an annex to it.
Okay.
And that's where they decided to put the annex. And the anti-war protesters felt that was desecrating what was part of a historical area, and they vowed to not let it happen. So they actually had a movement called Move the Gym, and they weren't going to allow the bulldozers to come. And they eventually all got arrested. That was I believe in 77 time period. And so the kids were aware of that. So the Shaker students wanted to know, what kind of things can we do? And one of them said, well, let's have a protest of our own. There's the Move the Gym protest, let's have our own protest. And so they went to the principal, and they asked if they could protest, and the principal said yes. And they were allowed to go out in front of the school and have their own non-violent protest. And then we did a petition well, we did a petition. We did a letter of sympathy to the parents of the students that were killed that was signed then by several hundred of the students. And I still have the old letter. That
Do
was,
you have the list of the people?
well, I only kept the first page of it, and there aren't many names on the first page. And we got a letter back. We got a letter back from Elaine Holstein, who was Jeffrey Miller's son. And Jeffrey Miller was the one student that was shot right through the mouth and died instantly, and he's the one that Mary Jo Vecchio is bending over, the famous Pulitzer Prize photo. Right, the Campus Madonna shot. And she wrote back after receiving that letter. The date of this letter is May 25th, 1978. She says, every once in a while something happens that reminds me that it's not such a bad world after all, despite some of the evidence to the contrary. The letters from you and the students and faculty at Shaker Heights High School constituted such a reminder. My husband had read the letters before I got home yesterday, and he handed me the envelope with tears in his eyes. And once I read the beautiful letters and gasped at the number of students and faculty who had signed the letter, I could easily see why he was so moved. Please express to all those involved in the peaceful protest and rally conducted at your school on May 4th my feelings of gratitude that they remembered and the enormous effort it has brought, enormous comfort it has brought to me. My only frustration is I can't tell Jeff about all you wonderful people, but he wouldn't have been surprised. He had great faith in human nature. So that's the Shaker Heights connection to it. And in talking to some of the older Shaker Heights graduates that attended the school before I was there, on May 4th of 1970, a group marched out of the school upon hearing about the shooting and went out to the flagpole to lower the flag to half staff. And there was a big brouhaha about that. And one of the ones involved in that was, that told me about it, was Ann Warmer Benjamin, who's now the mayor of Aurora, former state representative. So again, the Shaker Heights connection.
The protests were against the Cambodian invasion. Wasn't that the main thing that
Originally, yeah. So the Friday protest was against the Cambodian invasion, but more, not just the invasion, but the war itself. Yeah. But and then it became a two-headed protest, at least as of Saturday when the Guard came onto campus. There were a number of people that felt they had no business being campus and shouldn't be there. And so the group that was gathered and protesting, they were protesting the war and the Guard's presence.
outside agitators was something
Yes.
I always heard about, and you addressed the weather underground. And is that the same as SDS, or were they the radical arm of SDS?
I think historians would agree that by May 4th of 1970, the SDS, they were no longer the radicals on that spectrum anymore, where once they were. But the Weather Underground, those were the much more radical. That said, SDS had a chapter at Kent State, and they were very involved in protests up to May 4th. Should mention Jerry Rubin, a Yippie, had come to Kent just about a month or two before the shooting, and I went and heard him, and I can only say he was bizarre. But he told those gathered that what we need to do to really affect change is all go kill our parents.
and buy this book.
Yeah. Steal this book, wasn't that?
Steal this book.
That's
right. Steal this book.
And of course, and he didn't say it like it was a joke. And of course, that's then reported in all the local newspapers, right? Here we have someone coming onto Kent's campus telling the kids to kill their parents. So that, when you start talking about this generation gap, right? So there's real fear about what the hell's going on up there at Kent. Were there outside agitators? Were there outside radicals involved? I can say that when I look at the pictures, I recognize an awful lot of my classmates.
Okay.
The Friday night riot, I knew the people not all, but I knew a lot of the people that were engaged in that.
Mhm.
And one of them I'd played football at Kent with, Mike Brock. A number of those people involved in that protest, that riot downtown, had red headbands on, which I didn't think was a coincidence. I think that was the leader, those are the leaders of the group. And when I look at the pictures from May 4th, you can identify an awful lot of those as students. Now, some of them weren't, though. I mean, Mary Jo Vecchio, she wasn't a student.
Yeah. Yeah.
She turned out to be a 14-year-old runaway.
Right.
And the only other thing I can offer on that is that on May 1st, when the riot happened, after the riot was quelled at Main and Water Street, those involved ran up to campus, and the sheriff's department followed them up Main Street to the edge of campus. And I, being curious, followed that whole thing and was on Main Street standing there, and I knew some of the sheriff deputies, and I heard people yelling obscenities at them, and I didn't like that, because first of all I didn't agree with the tactic of trashing my town, downtown, Kent, which isn't going to bring the war to a close. It's just going to piss people off and give Nixon more ammunition, no pun intended. And now you're yelling at people that I know who are just doing their job. They don't want to be out there breaking up a riot. And so I started to give it verbally to this guy that was doing that. And we got in a big argument. He looks back at me and he says, I came here from Bowling Green. I came here, we're starting the revolution. The revolution is going to start here at Kent. Now, maybe it's pulling my leg, I don't know. But he certainly, by his own words, was not local and had a purpose to be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there were some bad actors. But ultimately, the penalty for arson isn't death. And it was a small group that caused that fire and attacked the firemen. It was a small group of that 2,000. So arrest them and try them. But you can't use that as justification for shooting a bunch of people that aren't engaged in arson on a Monday afternoon in bright daylight.
And frankly, weren't even engaged in
They were, right.
the protest. It sounds like.
Yeah, many of them were not. So of the 4 that were killed, Jeffrey Miller was the one that we talked about already. He was actively engaged in protest. You can see him distinctly at the front of that group on the Commons. He was wearing kind of a cowboy yoke shirt, giving the finger to the guardsmen. And it's believed, and I certainly believe it, that he was targeted. He was facing the guardsmen when he was shot, again, right through the mouth.
Like eventually, from the day
I think it's
targeted, or
I don't
like
know.
he was on
I
a
think
hit
he was
list or
targeted.
radicals.
I don't think it was I'm going to shoot from the hip and I hit Jeff Miller. I think at some point, whether it was when they turned and fired and they saw him at the bottom of that other side of the hill, they decided to shoot him then, or they had an eye on him earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I can't, that's speculation on my part. But a lot of those that were shot and wounded and shot and killed were not specifically targeted by those that shot them at that time. Some of them are ricochets. I mean, these bullets are armor piercing.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the people that were injured, and I think even some of those that were killed, I wouldn't say inadvertent, but it wasn't I'm shooting at this specific person. I mean, 2 of them were behind cars when they were hit.
Indirect shot.
Yeah. And as I say, these things can go, one of them went through a metal sculpture, one of the bullets. One of the bullets went through a tree, right through the tree. I mean, that's how powerful these are. So of the protesters, 4 killed. Jeffrey Miller was involved in the protest. But no connection to Jeffrey Miller for anything else. He wasn't one of the ones ID'd as rioting on Saturday night, burning the building down. No connection to him Friday night downtown or causing any damage. Never been anything to suggest that I've seen. And then Allison Krauss was also involved in the protest with her boyfriend. But again, no connection to any violence on her part at all. And she had had an altercation with one of the guards guard commanders the day before because a guardsman had a flower in his barrel of his gun, and the guard commander told him to take it out, and she was standing there, and she said, "Don't you know that flowers are better than bullets?" Or is attributed to have said that. So 2 of the 4 were protesters. William Schroeder was an ROTC student and an onlooker, just like me. And I live with the fact that I could have been William Schroeder had my class been somewhere else and I be coming in the other direction. If I had been coming from the eastern side of the campus to the Commons, I would have been right where Schroeder was. Mm-hmm. He was on a hill watching, looking down, thought he was safe. But then the guard chased the protesters up toward him, and he was mixed with them. And then Sandy Schroer, she was a speech pathologist, and she was coming from a class over on the east side of campus, and just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, was not actively involved in the protest. Interestingly, I've heard, and I can't confirm it, that 3 of the 4 of them were in the very same class that was scheduled to meet later that day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
In terms of those that were injured, a number of them were protesters, a number of them weren't. Mm-hmm. Dean Kaler was the most seriously injured, and he was paralyzed. He was going to be a coach and a phys ed major at the time. He was a phys ed major, was going to be a coach, and he was shot through the spine, still paralyzed. Mm-hmm. He admits to having thrown stones in the Prentice parking lot, so he was involved in the protest. And then, of course, we talked about Alan Canfora. He was shot, I believe it was through the wrist. Tom Grace was shot through the heel. They were all involved in the protest, but many of the others were not.
You talked about, arguing with the guy protesting on Water Street. How much peer pressure was there, within, your time frame's culture of you got to be this, it's
a lot. You're either with me or you aren't, which is kind of what we're seeing today. That certainly existed then. Yeah.
And so if you weren't liberal, what'd they put you as? You're a fascist, conservative kind of thing, or you don't care? Was there any?
Well, I think that's one thing that people don't remember about that time that was really true. I mean, I remember my son Stephen, who's a 99 graduate of Shaker, coming home when he was a junior and taking history, saying, "Dad, we talked about the 60s. Dad, were you a hippie?" I think it looks like all the students back then were hippies. And it's like, well, not really. I mean, we had a variety of views back then. And the vast majority, I think, of young people were kind of in the middle. Mm-hmm. But certainly the draft had a lot to do with anti-war sentiment.
Yeah.
I think had the draft not been in effect, I don't know that you would have seen the level of protest that we saw. Now the draft was over by that time the Kent State shooting had happened. We'd gone to a lottery the fall before, but nevertheless, people's lottery numbers had been picked, and if you were number 1, you were going.
Right.
So particularly at Kent, Kent still has a lot of students whose parents did not go to college. They're the first in their family to ever go. Was known for that back then. And those students tend to be a little more conservative. They're working back when, in 1970, an awful lot of those students were part-time, or if they were full-time, they were working. You could work your way through school back then. What a novel concept.
Had state colleges sort of started then? Is that when?
They'd been around, but they hadn't been that big.
Okay.
So Kent had been a fairly small school, and in the 60s just exponentially grew.
How big
now
was
you got to remember, going to college was a draft deferment.
Yeah.
So that was one reason a lot of kids went to school that maybe normally wouldn't have. And quite frankly, the thing back then was they were flunk-out courses. So the universities were trying to decrease the number, as crazy as that sounds. Now they're begging for students. But there were flunk-out courses, they were called, and a lot of the students after the first year who really normally wouldn't have gone ended up flunking out anyhow. Now one way to then avoid the war was what? Join the National Guard.
National Guard, yeah.
So here's an irony, right? The men that were shooting at the protesters And the onlookers,
Had
why were
avoided
they in the
now.
Guard?
Yeah.
Now, some of them had served and were now sticking with the military by being the Guard, but it was a deferment, it was a way of getting out of going to Vietnam for those that couldn't afford to go to college or couldn't stay in college. And so kind of an irony, a little bit of a social class, I thought, animosity between the protesters and the Guardsmen. The Guardsmen tended to come from more lower working class families in Kent, Ravenna, Worcester.
So they're jealous of the bougie students.
Yeah,
that-
yep, absolutely. So
yeah.
there was that going on. But some of the Guardsmen were Kent students too. I don't know how many, but certainly more than a handful.
Well, I had heard too that the outside protesters, it might have been you on the phone that said it to me, many of them were comprised of guys who had come home from Nam and hated the
Yes.
war so much that they were traveling around to organize protests.
Yeah, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War really gained a lot of power and steam, actually more after the Kent State shootings than before. And of course, one of our presidential candidates was one of those people. They had some huge protests in Washington, and they became a very potent political force. But yeah, certainly among the protesters, there were some Vietnam veterans, even on May 4th.